Hello, and thank you for tuning in to the Portland State University Studio MFA Remote Artist Talk series. This series is sponsored by generous contributions from the Wingate Foundation and the DePriest Professorship Fund by the Harold and Arlene Schnitzer Care Foundation. We would like to start this event by acknowledging that Portland State University rests on the traditional village sites of the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, bands of the Chinook, Tualatin Kalapuya, Molalla, and many other tribes who made their homes along the Columbia River. Multnomah is a band of Chinooks that lived in this area. We thank the descendants of these tribes for being the original stewards and protectors of these lands since time immemorial. This series brings together artists, curators, and critics from a variety of disciplines to explore the subjects of their work before a live audience. All of our lectures for the winter term are being held remotely and live streamed through our PSU YouTube channel. Please follow our Instagram account at PSU Studio MFA to learn more about artist talks in the future. At the end of this morning's presentation, we'll have a Q&A with Caroline Kent and the MFA cohort, and we will also be fielding questions through the live stream chat. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Caroline Kent. Caroline Kent is a Chicago-based artist that has founded her painting practice on strategies that construct language from the uncanny invention of shapes that exist between states of familiarity and ambiguity. Positing this painting language within the sight of the black ground tethers language through a metaphorical relationship to that which is unknowable, unlocatable, and illegible. Kent's practice is an ongoing inquiry and dialogue with the subjects of language, painting, and abstraction. Her contributions to the discourse of abstraction and painting include alternative logics that not only address material treatment, but backtalks to modernist tenants by creating frameworks that are in service to intimacy, the domestic, and time and space alterity. Over the past 4 years, Kent's expanded painting practice has become an articulation of space, object, and time through architectures, framing, and performance. These forms produce a choreography for bodies, allowing exhibitions to become fully involved installations. Kent's work considers that an abstract language beckons a context that speaks beyond what is possible in spoken language to the material and immaterial world. Caroline Kent received a BS at Illinois State University and received her MFA from the University of Minnesota. Kent has exhibited nationally at the Flag Art Foundation, New York, the Art Institute of Chicago, the Walker Art Center, Minnesota, the DePaul Art Museum, Chicago, the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago, and the California African American Museum, LA. Kent has received grants from the Joan Mitchell Foundation, the Pollock Krasner Foundation, the McKnight Foundation, the Jerome Foundation, and Artadia. Kent's work is in the collections of the Art Institute of Chicago, Walker Art Center, Minnesota, and the Dallas Art Museum of Texas. Thank you so much for speaking with us today, Caroline.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Andrea. It's wonderful to be here. It's really great. I really enjoy meeting with graduate programs and talking with students. I feel like my time in grad school wasn't that long ago, but I think it was. But it still feels like fresh in my mind in some ways. And I think it's always kind of enlivened when I meet with other students. So thank you all for having me. I am going to share my screen. Okay, here we are. So I'm going to be talking today about 3 aspects of what I call my practice and also praxis. But painting practice and praxis, I can't even say it, it's like a tongue twister. I'm going to be addressing all of these things today because I have found that there are differences among them, and the discovery has been really interesting in thinking of these 3 terms in specific ways. So as you learned maybe in the introduction, that I have a painting practice that is expanded, and it also has certain kind of ways of working that have become kind of notable now to my work. But I think before all that, a lot of my ideas and a lot of my ways of thinking about painting came out of very specific moments growing up and looking at the influences that kind of started my interest in thinking about language, thinking about the performative aspects of language, and thinking about how could these possibly intersect with painting, which is a visual art. It's not something that is thinking maybe in the same terms of film or television, film media, the things that were influencing me. So as I walk us through these kinds of influences, I think later all of these things kind of coalesced when I was really interested in thinking about abstract painting. So I look at this first kind of influence. Black and white film was something that not only I watched it regularly growing up, whether it was my father or my mother watching different films in black and white. I think it was one of the first introductions to thinking about how language is performed and feeling a kind of disconnect from the world that I lived in. That was, decades after these movies were produced. And so one of the questions that I often thought about was, the way that people speak and act in film, in these black and white films specifically, they felt so distant from the world that I lived in. And I didn't understand at a young age that there's a whole culture and a language associated with performance, and that, film is supposed to emulate and kind of reflect real life. But the kind of the way that in which language was spoken, and also the scripts were very poetic or written with real biting lines, really kind of tethered and came out of the literary that then transpired into theater scripts and then became the performed language on stage. All of those things were kind of, I was reacting to, responding to, and questioning in many ways. And I think that they finally kind of found a place later in my practice. But they were like these early ideas of thinking about the capability of language and what it can do, and why would one perform in this space and maybe not another space, or why is language then not ever performed in real life? And so that was an early question that I had. And also coming from a small town and also growing up in the Midwest and not having a lot of experiences of traveling outside of not only the Midwest, but even outside of the United States, my way of traveling and exposure to other parts of the world came through watching foreign language films. And they're now called international films. But back when I was watching them, this was my way of, learning about the world, learning about other cultures, and learning about the kinds of ways in which things are talked about or discussed. I found there were a lot of poetic musings, and a lot of the way in which the scripts were written for films from other countries were very different from my own. And so it was that contrast that kind of stuck out to me, the contrast of coming from a place that was very different than the places that I was looking at was fascinating to me. And I often felt that the scripts were much more closely tied to reading a novel. And the activity of reading subtitles and hearing foreign sound and looking within the visual frame to find more information, I found that within that space of grappling for understanding, I found that in that space, it was really unique to think about what happens when one grapples with language, and how these different elements became kind of conflated. And so when I was in grad school, I think that was my first initial time conflating these elements of thinking about a specific location in the world, a specific language and experience, and bringing all of those three things together. And it felt, when my interest in painting came about, I was really drawn to abstraction. I was drawn to abstract painting. I was fascinated by some of the things I had learned in school. And, my early relationship with Russian constructivism, and relating to that work out of just by relating to form and not being incited to want to know what the translation was. I think that was the first time that language, written language, I didn't desire to know a translation. I think the experience was enough, experiencing the form in that way, seeing the Russian Cyrillic text. And so I feel that this image that you're looking at now is a picture of when I spent time as a Peace Corps volunteer in the Eastern European country of Romania. I served as a volunteer from 2000 to 2002. And in that experience of moving to a country, this foreign land, and living in a culture that was so different from my own, not only like visually, but the practices and just everything was so different. I think it was one of these real-time moments where I started to connect the grapple between trying to communicate and understand. And in that space, I found that I wanted to make associations between what I was hearing to what I was seeing. And so there were ways in which the Romanian language was kind of visualized around me. Like I felt it was like this projection of a sound and how a sound might look. And then equating those two things together became something of interest to me, to kind of capture my experience. So those were the most pinnacle moments where, for me, creating a kind of language out of an experience was really significant. And it's something that I ended up carrying on throughout my practice. So what you're looking at is it's a small sheet of white paper, about 7 by 8 inches. And it has an abstract painting on the top, and it has typewriter text on the bottom. And so I would often make these abstractions on the top of the paper. And then after they dried, I would feed them through the typewriter, and I would kind of, I don't know, I think I felt like I would conjure up this, I don't know, protagonist that I had often seen in some black and white film. I thought of the most performed ways in which language felt growing up, and I started writing, and I would write these small little descriptions of these little moments, almost like small scenes, almost like character descriptions of someone I would see in a film, and I would start putting them together, and they were definitely inspired by these black and white films. And I started to question. This was my way of questioning, like, without satisfying the viewer's desire to see a representational image, replacing it with the abstraction. What does that do? And how does that open up a space for it to do something else? I mean, I wasn't interested maybe in frustrating someone or frustrating the viewer, but I wanted to think about, the abstraction being the space of projection for how one thinks about who personifies this language and what that looks like, and removing us from being engulfed in a filmic moment and pulling back some and thinking about the poetics of language, and who it is that often performs these things, and where they happen outside of film, perhaps. This was this body of work started off, just asking simple questions. And also, as I think of myself as a maker, so I'm also not only thinking in some ways critically about questioning, these larger questions of language, I'm still also making and thinking about, trying out new things in the studio, trying out new things, figuring out the place or role that I want abstraction to be in conversation with. And so, in some ways I was also thinking about historically, abstract painting was often, grandiose and larger than life scale. It had very specific, ambitious intentions sorry about that. It's my intercom. Anyway, just a way to kind of play around with form. And I think that this is really important as an artist to especially, coming out of grad school and thinking about what a practice might look like, I was really interested in like playing with form and figuring out the right kind of forms to take, but at the same time, allowing myself a kind of permission to go against things that were historical precedents, to not even consider them, to think about, okay, historically, these were the intentions or these were the tenets of modernism. Well, I'm really interested in a very different set of conditions. I'm really interested in creating the context for the kinds of questions I want to see if abstract painting can answer. And so I felt as if I was throwing very large questions at abstract painting. And I'm still asking these kinds of questions that I did not see reflected historically, but it didn't hold me back in any way. I think it, if anything, I think my line of questioning kind of reveals the way in which I moving through the world and also responding to the world I'm living in. So as I'm, you know, and on a personal level, I will say that these were actually really fun to make. It was really fun to kind of activate these kind of snarky kind of writings that had priorly only lived in journals, and I had only lived in like things that I would write for myself. So finding that place for them to finally come into my practice was really exciting. And it's an ongoing series that I do every so often. I kind of think in and around and through the performed language of the screen, and as I make these. And sometimes, you know, I think over time the questions will probably change, you know, and the kinds of things that I'm writing will change as well. Closed caption is something that also I got addicted to watching things in closed caption. And as someone who is not deaf, I think that actually it really made me dependent on having to read. And I did not listen as well when I was watching films. But I did it you know, initially out of this impetus to always never miss anything. So I was always reading in case somebody came into the room. But I really was drawn to the text in the image and the relationship of what it was describing, and thinking about how I could somehow use the space of a closed caption to address a different kind of allowing for a different kind of information being revealed in terms of abstract painting. So again, you know, there's questions I'm asking, but I'm also playing with form. And I was thinking about specifically abstract painting, and I'm going to sneeze. So maybe if I say I'm going to sneeze, I won't sneeze. I'm thinking about, I started working with cement and also working with paintings, and thinking about when I was working in cement, I really liked the kind of weight it had. The weight felt really compatible with the kind of emotional weight that is often felt through the literary, through written, through text. And so I wanted a material that could really kind of stand up to some of the things I wanted to print in it and embed in it. In this case, I was making these small diptychs. This is, I would say this is about 15 inches by 7 inches. Or maybe it's maybe 22 inches long. But I started to pair these two together to think about, again, like maybe the abstract painting space, you know, inserting that in the space of the film space, and thinking about this kind of added information at the bottom. And the added information says, eyes follow you across the room. So it was maybe in some ways a redundancy for seeing and for looking this piece of information, but also thinking of a kind of filmic trope, something that I had often seen in films, where someone is watching another person walk through the room, and thinking about what that gesture looks like, but also leaving that gesture to be created in the mind's eye, and thinking about what that means in relationship to a solid, a painting that just gives you a solid view, a blank screen. And there was also I was also thinking about the references to the color blocks that came on television after the television networks closed down for the night. And so you're just left with this band of these colors here. I often saw that as a child as well. And so anyway, again, this way of exploring was was really kind of enjoyable for me to work through different ways I was thinking about language and abstraction, and specifically with painting, which is going to bring us up to my dominant practice, which is creating paintings on an all black ground. And I often like to talk through this, that, I started off kind of working on paper. It seemed like the quickest and most immediate way to kind of build and develop an abstract painting language over time. I feel like I had been making abstract paintings up until this point, but then I started making these other kinds of works. And I really started to question my investment in abstract painting. I really wanted to know like what it is I really wanted to address, because I wasn't certain that painting had enough for me. I wasn't certain that my interest could carry me that long. And so I think I took some time away from making abstract painting to figure out like what is really at stake for me to continue abstract painting, and what is my level of investment. And because of that, when I returned to abstract painting, I had such clear ideas before me. But I started, but I didn't know the whole picture, to be very frank. I did not yet know, but I returned with a kind of intention that I had not experienced before. And so I kind of set up a rule. I wanted to make, I wanted to figure out the borders of what this language looked like. Okay, I think that was like the first step I took. And I started, I used these all identical sizes of paper, 22 by 30, and I would gesso them with an all black ground. I had done some other series of work that used black as a ground, and it fascinated me that I felt like it was such a new kind of territory to interrogate and to investigate and experiment with. The relationships of the colors to the ground using black was something that I felt I needed a long while to kind of figure out what that meant and what it did, and how it kind of opened up the ways in which I was thinking about color. So I did not have all the pieces in the beginning. I feel like they over time kind of fell into place, and they expanded and they grew with my kind of ways of working. And so I call it now this kind of archive I go back to, because in the beginning I started making these works on paper and they expanded. I went from making, 20 to then 40, then 100. And then after the collection grew to about 200, there were just different things I could do with them. I would lay them out on the ground. I would look for relationships. I would look for marks and patterns and things that I was doing that really seemed to define the vocabulary. And then there were other things that felt really experimental. It was an opportunity to use improvisation. It was an opportunity to explore, experiment in any way. There were no rules. And a lot of these I made in one sitting. I made them in one sitting. And then there were other ways I decided to work, where I would work on 4 or 5 at a time. And then I would think, okay, let me make some and put them away, and then come back after a few months and make a second move on them. But I did not belabor them in any way. So they have like one coat of the background, the ground black, and then a lot of them have one layer. I mean, over time, there were different ways I employed working on them that to keep my interest and to keep myself learning and to keep myself expanding on the kinds of things I was learning. So it was exciting. And there were times I worked in series. There were times, I mean, the ones you're looking at, they look as if I've spent time really thinking about composition. But I think one of the things I learned was after making so much, I became quite proficient in figuring out the compositions, and I came much more confident with every move. And so from there, I decided I would like to move beyond that and expand the form. I would like to move beyond these small works on paper and think about what else do I want to now make from this kind of vocabulary that's been created. And so I decided to make some very large scale paintings. And these paintings, I decided I wanted to have them look different than paintings I was used to seeing. I wasn't interested in that for myself. I think I wanted to have a slower moment where one couldn't write them off so quickly. Oh, that's painting. Oh, I get it. It's a painting. I know exactly what that is. I think I wanted the viewer to slow down, to consider that the form might be informing something else, another layer of information about the work. And so I decided to stretch them on the wall. These are about 9 feet tall, 6.5 feet wide. I gessoed and prepped them on the wall. And then I decided to kind of tackle this new scale. And one of the things I learned a lot of different things after making these for a few years. My working methods changed over time. There are paintings that this one here really I started to like make these undershapes and then go on top of those undershapes with shapes on top. And really it became almost like symbols, and they operated almost like a chart. There were other ways of working where I allowed the ground to just be a ground. And then I think it took me a whole year before I decided to even try bringing the ground over the top of the image and creating a kind of space. And so there was a lot of discovery that happened. The color black, it went from being a ground to being a space. And then it became very atmospheric once I started to use that space for things to go in and out of, and to ask certain kinds of questions like, what does it mean to have a desire to create a kind of language that takes up its residence inside a site of blackness? That became something to me as I started really writing about my work and writing about my practice and writing about what interests me, and also writing about some of the unknowns, and thinking about, the language that seems to arrive to the surface and then kind of escape. It reassembles itself, it changes, and it kind of shifts. And yet it arrives different every time. More recently, I've been bringing in these kind of symbols and marks. I like to think of them as a kind of registration, this kind of way to underscore the different shapes and to kind of indicate toward thinking about like pronunciation or enunciation, a kind of significance with these forms within their compositions. So I am thinking in many ways about a written language, a graphic language, and what it can do. And I also, one of the ideas that I kind of took and expanded on was this idea that the paintings can act as a site for context, and the context could be for a performance, maybe something theatrical in some way, but also, that is an initial idea, but then moving that out into space and thinking about what can happen. I think it's important to note that my ideas about exhibiting really shifted with this exhibition called How Objects Move Through Walls. I was given this opportunity for a solo exhibition by a good friend of mine, Cameron Gaynor, and he had encouraged me to come in and spend a few days installing. And I remember thinking like, well, why would I need a few days? I know exactly where everything should go. I already have a plan. And I think that his encouragement for me to get into the space was more so that I could really think about how this work wants to respond to the space and how it wants to behave in that kind of space. And I think it was a very, very helpful moment. It was really poignant because I started to realize that when all the work is just in my studio, it's not out. I don't get to see how it wants to act in different spaces, and how it wants to act in those spaces might be very revealing about how this language, where the potential lies in this language, and how this work can function in different ways and very dynamic ways. And so I think of the exhibition as the real praxis. I think of it as rehearsals in many ways, that it's not a final assembling of the work, but it is one in which I get to figure out something. It's like figuring it out in using the exhibition space as that space to figure things out, an extension of my studio, if you will. But that really shifted my thinking, that the exhibition is really in service to me in my practice. I actually need that. I need it to understand the work better. And I think that shifted my experiences before that were I put myself in the position of, oh, I get to have this exhibition. And I think that kind of positioning of myself didn't really open up all the possibilities that were going to be in service to me, growing in my questioning, growing in the ways I wanted to work. It was, I wanted to be the one that really fully benefited first and foremost so that I can continue on in this kind of research. And so that's not to say that there is no benefit for others after that, because I do think that it's been very exciting to create these kind of compositions and exhibition spaces. And so what you're looking at here is a wooden painted object up on the wall. Behind it is, I painted directly on the wall. And these were kind of improvisational. I knew I wanted to paint something, but I didn't know what. And so I just did it in the space. I think that working like that was really helpful. It got me, one, it just gave me confidence that I know my work and I know the practice, that I can do it on the spot if I need to. I can move in that kind of way. And so the wooden objects around the space were all titled bodily movements that could be performed. I ended up working with two wonderful women dancers that came in, and from those titles of those objects in the room, there were about 5 of them. They created a performance that dealt with, I think like the way that they created the score was not only using those, but also this idea of 2 individuals that meet that don't speak the same language and how they might communicate. And so there was also a musical component as well that was kind of like sci-fi strangeness. It was really a fun experience. It was really exciting to see it come together. I had never tried something quite like that, although there was one other performance that happened in my work. But I wanted to show these in thinking about like how far one can expand, working from 2-dimensional and moving through these different mediums out into 4 dimensions, but also thinking like there are no rules that keep you static in your interests. And that if you have a real desire to do something, I guess that is the challenge of how to make sense of that, doing that thing within your practice and where it can lead you. I'm going to go back just real quick. This was a drawing I made. This is also another way in which I like to kind of write scores for movement or to be translated in some way. And so they're drawings of forms, and then I've written specific movements that can be performed with each for each one. And they're kind of like, they're open for interpretation. I do not have a specific way in which these would be translated into a performance. And I like that openness, because then it will take another person to have to then further translate what this might look like. Moving on from there, I'm going to try to be mindful of the time. So these 3 works on paper became I would say, the score for another performance that happened. I worked with a dance troupe in Omaha, Nebraska, and they created a piece called Language for the Living. And it was inside of an exhibition I had that was kind of immersive because all the walls have been painted. And so they created a piece, and it was performed during the opening of my exhibition. And it was very exciting seeing someone else translate my work from 2 dimensions into real time. There were ways in which we worked together that made so much sense. A lot of it felt really intuitive, and it was really exciting. And things were not like the way that their bodies moved. I mean, there was definitely a gap in between the image and the performance, because things were not literal. They were not trying to make the actual forms in the paintings. But there was already a likeness of form that I think connected them, and that became really fascinating. I'm going to move us through some other ones really quickly to get to the final series of work. But I had the walls built out to kind of create a frame for the painting, and placed wooden paintings on the outside, thinking about thresholds and trying to really play with different ways in which space in the gallery could lend itself to the way we think about the paintings, like thinking about the site of blackness, thinking about that signifying that one is about to encounter a different kind of space and what that feels like, what that looks like, how to create that sensibility or speak to those things. This is another exhibition called Writing Forms, where I'm thinking specifically about the way in which language, there were some ways in which language shows up that I'm trying to intersect with abstract painting. Here, there's a wall painting and a freestanding sculpture. And so you'll notice that the sculpture was used priorly in another exhibition. But here, when it shows up again, it has a different kind of function. And so I like to think of my practice as having moving parts that don't have the same, they're not acting in the same way they were maybe an initial time that they were shown. And it gave me freedom to play in between, the kind of staging of the work and also setting up new kinds of relationships. So here, the wooden shapes that are on the wall that were before on a threshold are almost acting like punctuation here in the space. You can see it on either side of that space that might be a kind of text or a quote or some other way in which, the language that you find between two quotations. I also had smaller works on the wall that were kind of in these spaces that drew the viewer in to a kind of private moment with these distilled forms. There's a better image so that you kind of see. I mean, these opportunities, this was in a project space in Milwaukee. And, I remember painting this on the wall, and then there's this large beam in the way. And then there's this moment where you want it to be this, oh, if only the beam was out of the way. But, at some point, I think I'm dealing with the space that's there, and I'm dealing with the ideas that are there. And I also think again, this is a rehearsal. This is one iteration of this idea coming to fruition. There will be more opportunities in different ways. And I just really wanted to, afford myself the freedom to try something new. And I'm just saying that because the conditions aren't always going to be maybe ideal, but I think that you can't let those things become hurdles, and that you make what you need to make and keep moving, because there's, having a pristine setting all the time. I mean, maybe that's not what your work needs to be in. Maybe it needs to be in a different kind of space. It needs to respond to architecture. It needs to be interrupted by a beam, to maybe think about what that might do. What does it say? So this is a final body of work I'm bringing us to, called Victoria Veronica. I titled it after my mother's first two names. And the reason I did that was because I had been to Mexico prior to making this work, and I had met some family members I had never met before. My mother is Mexican. And I think I started really thinking about duality. And I started thinking about, and I liked my mother's first two names because they sound like two first names. And they also sound like they could be like twins, like Victoria is one and Veronica the other. And which one do we attribute with being the good twin or the bad twin or the mischievous or the quiet? Like, how do we associate in those terms with names? And also thinking of my own background as an identical twin, I started thinking about communication. And I was thinking, where else could abstract painting show up? And so I think I'm at this point where I'm really interested in thinking, how can I always change the set of conditions under which abstract painting is functioning? And so I found that in the space of the way in which my twin sister and I communicate, it's not that we have a secret language, and it's not that the kind of way we speak is only identical twins. We speak in a very abbreviated manner where we can, yes, sometimes finish each other's sentences, but it's more that we don't need to have a long conversation to get to what we're talking about. I think because we know each other so well, and also that we probably frame the way we look at the world very similarly, there are ways in which we can abbreviate and get to the heart of a matter much quicker. And so in that space of abbreviation, which I find can also be very similar to any two individuals that share a large amount of time together, that are partners, that are intimate, find the abbreviation, they find the space of abbreviation, and that can be in a gesture or it can be spoken. It can be in different kinds of ways. And so thinking about that and recognizing that, I kind of set up this fictional framework for producing this work, where these two identical twins, Victoria and Veronica, are making artworks for each other as a means of communicating, and that these artworks are felt and sent to one another. And so it was really exciting because I wanted to deal with a space, and I wanted the space to be a kind of domestic space, and thinking about where else can this abstract language function and play within the parameters of. And I found it with this framework. And so here you're looking at an exhibition space with a painting on the wall. So the brown areas and the light brown areas have been painted, and then there are objects. On the left, there's actually a video. It's on an iPad. And it was a video I had made really analog back in like 2013. And they are two static photographs of myself looking at each other. They're actually not myself and my twin. And then it's subtitled as well. So it was actually an opportunity to bring into circulation this older artwork that I had made, that I hadn't yet found a place for it to connect. And it took some time, but it seemed to make the most sense to bring it into here. There is also a small diptych on the right. This is also in the space. The wooden plant stands, they're just wooden boxes, and they have these paintings inserted in them. And so that this visual language between the twins kind of moves through objects, it moves through the wall, it moves through paintings. And here's a better view of the painting in the side of the wooden box. There was also a speaker embedded in the plant that was giving off a low frequency sound that you could hear if you finally stood still in the space. And then finally, there was a book stand that I saw in the Mexican architect's home, Luis Barragan, a place that I had toured when I was in Mexico City. And I thought this object was fascinating. And so it's recreated here, and it acts as the kind of psychic conductor to make possible the communication between these twins. And so on it, what I think it's important to say is that I found a resting place in a way. These are some of the other objects. There's cement again, and then there's the linen and paint. I found a place for a lot of older art objects and writings and small fragments to finally find a place. And that was really exciting for me, because I think, your practice, you make a lot of different kinds of work, and some work never sees the light of day, and some of it you hide away, or it never kind of fully matures to what you want to use or put out there. But I found that this book stand, I knew I wanted to have it made, but I didn't know what exactly would go on it. I thought maybe just paintings, but it really became important to put past ideas, all the things that influence the way I think about my practice, early ideas, places I've been. What you're looking at in front of you are a collection. There's a handkerchief that has typed text on it. There are postcards that have watercolors on them. There's a wooden cutout form. And then there's a book cover that's been painted. And many of these things are initial ideas as well. So these are and this was a project space here in Chicago called Tiger Strikes Asteroid. And the project space really allowed me a kind of freedom that was, just open for experimentation. And I think those moments can be really, really rich moments to take advantage of, to not think that, to not maybe privilege spaces, one space over another, to do what you need to do in any kind of space that's available is important. So with that, I will leave it at that. That is the end of my lecture. And feel free to unmute if you want, because Zoom is so strange. It's so silent after that. But I can either, oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
Oh, no. I was just going to thank you so much for your presentation. It was amazing. I guess I'm going to open the floor for questions if anyone has a question first, whether that be in the chat or I can open it up also.
I have a question.
Okay.
Well, first, do you mind unsharing the screen, Caroline?
Mm-hmm. Definitely.
I'll be in the space. I was really curious about the integration of sound in that in that last installation that you showed us. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Definitely. So I wanted some element in there to kind of get at the psychic as well as like the science fiction kind of element of transcending time and space and dimension. And I thought about how could I do that? You know, it was like, there's a kind of conjuring that is definitely happening. And I was like, I want to get at that in a way that isn't, I mean, one of the ideas was I was thinking like, maybe I should like have a chair just like stuck to the wall up in some corner. Okay, that would be almost maybe like poltergeist or something. But I was like, I needed to get at the sublime. And I found that this low frequency that you only caught if you stopped moving, because that space echoes. And so just like shuffling around, you might not hear it. But when you stop to actually look at something, you can hear this frequency. And you're like, wait, what is that? And that was my first time bringing in like audio. And I don't think it's my last, but I really thought it was interesting to do that. And I had to experiment with that.
Darby.
I have a question. I was super excited to hear you're a Peace Corps volunteer. I was a Peace Corps volunteer as well a few years back. And one of the things that I think is so interesting that you touched on, and I experienced myself to a degree, was the like moving into a place and having especially if it's a new language. I don't know if you spoke Romanian before you went there, but how language becomes so abstract, and trying to communicate, like even as you're acquiring the language slowly, how it there's that like method of communication, which you were talking a little bit about via the dance installation. And I was wondering if you could just expand a little bit more about how that experience of acquiring a new language, if that was a new language for you, has changed the way that you perceive, I don't know, about abstraction of sound and how that relates to your painting.
It's such a great question. And I think it has taken me like 20 years to figure out certain things. I mean, I just think I ruminated after that experience. It took a long time to tease out everything happening. But one of the ideas that, and I will say I returned home in 2002. In 2005, I was in grad school, and it was a 3-year program. And I think I flirted with ideas of bringing in language for a while. And finally, like my 3rd year, I was like, okay, I'm going to deal with this directly. This was Romania. And the most poignant thing I can draw out, of course, in hindsight during that experience, was that in the space of the grapple, when you are trying to learn a new language, which I did, I was fluent in Romanian. Now I may be just barely proficient, but I was fluent. But in that grapple of trying to make sense and trying to speak and communicate, I conflated aspects of architecture, landscape, and language all into one thing. It took me a few years to figure that out. I did that. But now when I look at abstract painting, I realize that the viewer also has this kind of grapple. And so you're looking at this abstract painting, you understand it's a painting. Some of the forms kind of bring the viewer close because of familiarity, but then they're not really the thing that they're referencing. And so and then one desires like, but what does this mean? And in that grapple, what is it that they grab onto? I conflated everything, and there are ways in which people respond in that space of the grapple. And I think I'm really curious about how people do that in that space, like when one grapples with abstraction, when you're not sufficed, when you're not given or satisfied in some way, how do you respond to that? And I'm hoping that it doesn't cause one to just turn away. I mean, many people get frustrated with abstraction. They're like, and so that seems to be the biggest thing that I've got out of the experience of the Peace Corps and the kinds of questions I had with language and thinking now about painting.
Raja.
Thank you so much for your presentation. My question, you might have addressed it a little bit in your response just now, but I'm really interested in what you said about abstraction and the unknowable and the illegible. And I was curious if you could say a little bit more about that and maybe in your process or how maybe when you're working, how you're thinking about it or how you might write about it in like applications maybe. Thank you.
No, it's a great question, and I definitely didn't talk on it enough in the lecture. But it's something I started thinking more and more about as I started thinking about early thoughts I had for, first of all, thinking about abstract painting as a site to do something else in. And then I removed the idea of just the painting, but what about this site of Blackness? I mean, Blackness seemed to afford so many possibilities. Because literally what it does in the paintings is that it obscures forms, it hides forms. And I thought like, well, what does that mean to have this kind of space available where a language hides inside it, and language starts not only occupying that space, but it also kind of can't be pinned down. It stays kind of always changing and arriving. And what is that in service to is a great question that I like to think about. And that I don't like to pin down, because I think that when languages are I feel like when languages are birthed, it's out of necessity. There's a reason why this language needs to stay in this form. And there's a reason why this language needs to keep a level of legibility, illegibility, I should say. And that I think about the way in which the paintings function in where the viewer is drawn in through the familiarity. Some of these forms feel safe and familiar, but I'm still thinking dark thoughts about what it wants to do and how it wants to disrupt and misbehave in a way. And I'm reading, what am I reading? I'm actually reading this book on Buford Delaney and the writer Baldwin. But I read a lot of different things, and I'm interested in what some of the poets are talking about, and I'm interested in some of the intersections of what it can do. But yeah, I think there's more for me to tease out there, but I think that's the agency I'm trying to give the work is I want it to do the things I'm thinking about. I want to be just aware that there might be certain kinds of limitations with visual representation. Even though it is abstraction, it's still there a representation of a kind of language and what it wants to do and what that is in service to. And so I think it's something that I'm constantly returning to and pushing myself with and thinking about. But I do think, like, to speak to your point about the unknowable, I recently did a talk about process and language, and it was in the context of the Black Pentecostal Church. And I've always been, maybe that's kind of the sci-fi spiritual space I really like to think about. And I've wanted to move and push my work into dialogue in that way, because there is this kind of way where people are often expressing themselves, whether it's the church or even other kinds of spaces that are non-language, or they are kind of share a mystical space. And I like thinking about abstract painting in those terms, that it's getting at the uncanny, it's getting at the unnameable, things that don't have names, that language can't use to describe. That kind of thing appeals to me way more than just thinking solely in formal terms. That there is something that is even maybe hidden from me in kind of working these up. I'm questioning, like, you know, and I'm learning. So it's like, when people ask me like, well, what does the work mean? And I'm like, well, what is it doing? If you start to describe what it's doing and how it's behaving, you start to learn you start to learn more. And I find that, you know, when I was interested in other worldly languages, I was like, okay, I can probably learn more if I go to the people that speak this language, look at the culture it's set in, look at and learn these different things, and maybe learn something more about the language and the people. And so I think I started to think about, like, maybe it started with the language. And as I move out and expand these forms, I learn about the culture and I learn about the people. And that is like reverse and yet exciting. And it still has a long way to go. So I hope I answered your question, Raja.
Yeah, that's really great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
You're welcome.
In your during your presentation, you said projection of sounds and how a sound might look, and I thought that was really interesting. And when it comes to, you also talked about Russian constructionism. I can't really say it, and also the poetics of film, and so and then also communicating with your family. And the intersection of painting. And I guess, like, are all those, would you say that you would see that in sound? Did that question make sense? I'm sorry.
Well, let me see if I can understand what you're saying. So all those different moments, when I was having early experiences with film, when I was having experiences with my twin, did I see those things in sound? And to be honest, no, I didn't, but I didn't see any of those things until they, like, later kind of, they manifest slowly. And so, but I will say that when I was watching, I think it's the conflation. So I think that when I was watching a lot of those language films, foreign language films, you know, I'm hearing these different sounds, and that was titillating in some ways, because I would try to imitate them. You know, you hear these different sounds and your mouth is not used to doing that. So there's a kind of gesture. It provoked me to want to perform these things I did not understand. And maybe that's another extension of why I'm attracted to abstract painting, of making these things that can't be, I don't have, you know, this language can't be translated in the same way. But yet it can be translated maybe in any way. And there's a way it works against the things. I feel like the things that inspired me were so structured. There were specific ways of understanding, and I ended up maybe just running in a different direction and asking maybe questions that historically were so inappropriate, or so not the questions that people were asking abstract painting. And
okay. Thank you.
I hope I answered your question.
I can ask another question if no one has a question right now. Mainly because, like, I'm mainly immersed in thinking about the digital at the moment. The last 3 weeks more than ever. I mean, it's always been kind of like in the periphery, but, you know, you kind of talk about, like, architecture in relation to language and culture, and but also abstraction and painted abstraction as a way to, like, kind of distill, like, a synesthetic response to culture, given those components. And I was just wondering, the way, I mean, it's like you presented a lot about, like, spatial culture, right? Like, things that you see as you experience them out in the world. But I was wondering, given the pandemic, if, you know, you have a similar response to digital architectures and the way that we're kind of living within digital frameworks at the moment.
That's
And
an
if,
interesting
you know,
question.
if that's not something that you're doing, that's fine too.
Oh, the
I was
digital.
curious.
You know what? I have to be very honest and say that I don't have a hard relationship to that. I'm so analog. Like I prefer to be much more analog. And I'm super analog in some ways. I mean, almost to a fault. Like I create sculpture by like cutting out some index cards and making a model. And then I'm like, so I'm not, I guess maybe I want, because I don't go toward the digital, I'm trying to preserve something. I'm trying to preserve this kind of way of being that I feel like is going to be totally lost in one more generation, or else they're going to be like, wow, that's so novel. Scissors to cut out to make art. Weird. Like carry books around like, hey, I'm kind of, being like what, the older generations were, I think like things like that. So I'm not actually looking, but both of my kids are into Minecraft. So they are really good at creating these worlds and everything. But I have no desire to like pick the iPad up and try it myself. It's weird. But they are all in, they're addicted.
I guess I was just like asking about it in terms of like a synesthetic response, and that's like assuming this like you like you interact with the digital quite a lot, despite having doing a lot of your work in the studio. But yeah, like I totally get it. Thank you.
You're welcome, Ralph.
Melanie?
I had a question. It's regarding how you've started like reinterpreting space in terms of how you show your work to audiences. I was wondering if, because of like COVID and people not being able to interact with spaces like that as much, or like the spaces, maybe if you interpret them differently now, or you would maybe alter them differently based on your experiences of being home more. I was just curious if you have like a new view on how you want to interact with them.
Huh. And are you talking about exhibition spaces?
Exhibition and even studio spaces now.
Gosh, well, my one fortunate thing is that my studio space is where I live. And so that was a huge help over the pandemic. I could escape in here. But to your point about thinking about exhibition spaces, I don't know if it was the pandemic that did it, but I think that just even like going back and thinking about what I said about spaces and taking the opportunity and not having a hierarchy and treating spaces, like go 100, even on a small space that no one might see, like to really put everything into it. I think that's more important. That's the most important thing. And I say these things, but I have to be reminded of them as well. I have to remind myself, to not maybe privilege a space or be intimidated by a certain kind of space, to keep myself always just working on my feet, like thinking like, I think it takes a lot to not get overwhelmed by a kind of space, because architecture has that built into it. It has austerity and grandiose, and beautiful architecture can make one feel a certain kind of threat. And I think it's more important to be able to push against that and use that in your favor, and to not be so influenced in that way, but to allow your work to do something unique and magic in any space it's in.
Thank you. That's super interesting.
Are there any more questions? Well, I guess this wraps our, hold on, there's a script. Thank you so much for joining us. This concludes our artist talk and the end of the MFA Studio Visiting Artist Talk series this year.